This is a little primer for the fourth listening party, which will be Mozart's Piano Concerto in D minor, number 20, and then a 10-minute break, and then Beethoven Symphony number 7. And this listening party is happening on Sunday, the 5th of April at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and the Discord links will be below this video in the description. I had planned to do a thorough video on concertos and concerto form in the style of my other How to Listen to Classical Music videos. That hasn't happened yet, so let me give you a quick primer, something to think about when you listen to Mozart. The key to the concerto is that it's not about mere virtuosity, it's all about balance. Mozart wrote some of the most exquisite concertos because he understood and perfected this idea of balance, as well as having an excellent grasp of harmony, modulation, variety and contrast, tone, motivic development, and fullness of counterpoint. The challenge of the concerto is one of balance, balancing the solo instrument with the orchestra, the individual versus the crowd. I'm not going to give a full analysis or history here, but I'll talk about how Mozart approached this problem. An understanding of symphonic form and sonata form will help. So, the risk of having the soloist and orchestra do everything at the same time is either the soloist will fail to penetrate the orchestra at all, or the orchestra will act as mere accompaniment and never get the chance to show its real force. It's far easier to let the orchestra come in first with a statement of the material, and then have the soloist come in with a counterstatement of the material. This way, we can show off the impressive force of the solo as it thrusts the orchestra into the background, yet, at the same time, the orchestra has had its say and has not been unduly and prematurely repressed by the solo. So, the orchestra will introduce the material first. This is called a ritornello. And the ritornello will also come back at the end of the piece too, once the solo has reached his climax. The solo can be more active, personal, eloquent than the orchestra, and so it can make a brilliant climax if it wants to. But it cannot make its climax very loud in sound or powerful compared to the full orchestra. And so the piece will start with an orchestral ritornello, and it'll also end with a ritornello. However, throughout the movement, the soloist and orchestra might share the material a bit more closely, moving between solo phrases with orchestra accompanying and orchestral phrases where the soloist blends into the background. So that's the basic concept. Let's add a bit more detail. I'll presume you're familiar with sonata form. In a typical first movement of a concerto, sonata form will be modified to make up for the needs of this formal balance. Typically, in a Mozartian concerto, the orchestra will start with a ritornello, and that ritornello will introduce us to our first and second subject, as well as possibly some other themes. However, all this first and second subject material will be in only one key, instead of two or more keys like a typical sonata exposition. Then, after this orchestral ritornello, the soloist will appear, arresting our attention as the entry of a personal voice. The soloist will then restate these first and second subjects somewhat more at leisure and in their proper contrasting keys. After this, there might be a short restatement of an orchestral tutti, and that marks the end of the exposition. From there, the soloist and orchestra work together, figuring out a development and recapitulation of this musical material. Once the recapitulation reaches its end, the movement will end with a final orchestral tutti. However, this tutti will be interrupted by a cadenza from the solo player. A cadenza is a virtuoso extended solo passage where the soloist can have their final say and show off their skill and ability to develop the theme even further. In Mozart's time, these cadenzas would have been improvised based on the themes of the movement. And this improvisatory character enhanced the impressiveness of the soloist. Still today, some performers choose to improvise or write their own virtuosic cadenzas. Finally, the cadenza will come to an end and the orchestra plays us out. So, to summarize the first movement design, the orchestra plays a terse exposition showing us both themes but in the same key. Then the soloist enters and follows this same exposition, only now taking more leisure with the themes and going into contrasting keys. Then there is a development and a recapitulation involving both orchestra and soloist. And the movement will end with a virtuosic solo cadenza and a final sign-off from the orchestra. A wonderful way to balance the formal problem of solo versus orchestra. There are very few concertos that follow this scheme to the absolute letter, but it's a useful scheme to understand, especially when listening to Mozart and the likes. So, the other movements of the concerto are typically less complex. They use more sectional forms, and soloist and orchestra can alternate more simply than in the first movement. The composer doesn't need to put such an emphasis on the entry of the solo, now that it has won its friendship with the orchestra. So, the ritornello doesn't play such a big part in later movements, though it can still feature. Traditional concerto finales are almost always some kind of rondo, that is, a sort of A-B-A-C-A structure. So Mozart might give the main theme, the A theme, to the solo with a large number of orchestral accessories. But in the returns of the main theme, the orchestra may be absent until the final recurrence of the main theme, where the solo will once again share with the orchestra as they round off the concerto together. So you see, it's all about careful balance between soloist and orchestra, and I think you'll find that it's something Mozart does exquisitely well. Onto the Beethoven. I'm not going to play the themes here as we can announce them as they come while we're listening through Discord. But what you should know is the first movement starts with a long, slow, expansive introduction. The introduction feels like a movement unto itself, so you can listen as it unfolds. But then the tempo changes to a vivace, fast tempo, and we're met with this bouncing rhythm. Bum ba ba bum ba ba bum ba ba bum and bum ba ba bum ba ba bum ba ba bum ba 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 ba. A bit like this rhythm literally takes over the whole of the first movement, and it's a bit like the way that the rhythm ba 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 bum ba 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 bum ba 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 bum takes over the whole of the first movement of Beethoven 5. The second movement, the slow movement, is extremely famous. It starts with a slow, marching, dirge-like chord sequence before this wonderful, expansive melody seeps in. The movement is structured in a kind of ABA-BA form, and the B section is a more cheerful tonic to the A section. The third movement is a typical scherzo trio form, where there's a fun, exciting scherzo and a more noble trio in the middle, as you'd expect. And the final movement is a whirlwind of a sonata form, a real joyride to round off the symphony. So I hope you'll join me tomorrow. That's Sunday, the 5th of April at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Discord links are below this video, and you'll need Spotify, ideally Spotify Premium. Thank you for watching, and if you want to support my work, you can visit my Patreon page at patreon.com/inside the score.